Dean Martin was in the middle of telling one of his famous drinking jokes when Johnny noticed something nobody else saw. Dean's hands were shaking. Not from alcohol, but from something much deeper. What happened in the next 12 minutes would become the most heartbreaking moment in Tonight Show history. Dean Martin, the man who made millions laugh, was about to reveal a pain so deep that even Johnny Carson couldn't hold back his tears. March 21st, 1987. Studio One in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was preparing for what everyone assumed would be a lighthearted evening. Dean Martin, one of America's most beloved entertainers, was scheduled to appear. The producers expected the usual Dean Martin charm, smooth jokes, playful banter about his drinking persona, maybe a song. But the moment Dean walked through the studio doors, everyone who knew him could tell something was fundamentally different. Dean Martin had built a career on being unshakable, cool, collected, always in control. He was one half of the legendary Martin and Lewis comedy duo, a member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., a movie star, a television icon, and a recording artist with hits that defined an era. Dean's entire public persona was built on effortless confidence and charm. That night, there was nothing effortless about him. Johnny Carson had known Dean for over 30 years. They'd done countless shows together, shared private dinners, golf games, late-night conversations that the public never saw. Johnny knew Dean's rhythms, his patterns, the way he moved and spoke and joked. And the man who walked onto that stage on March 21st, 1987, was not the Dean Martin Johnny knew. The audience, of course, erupted in applause when Dean appeared. They saw the Dean Martin they expected, the tailored suit, the perfectly styled hair, that famous smile. But Johnny saw what they couldn't. The smile was forced. Dean's eyes, usually sparkling with mischief and warmth, were hollow, and his hands, those steady hands that had held microphones and cocktail glasses and never wavered, were trembling. Dean sat down in the guest chair, and Johnny started with what should have been an easy opening. "Dean Martin, ladies and gentlemen, it's always great to have you here. How have you been?" It was a softball question, the kind Johnny had asked Dean 100 times before. The kind that usually launched into a funny story or a self-deprecating joke about Dean's legendary drinking. But Dean didn't answer right away. He looked at Johnny, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition, of understanding. Johnny's smile faded slightly, and he leaned forward, giving Dean space to respond however he needed to. "Johnny," Dean said finally, his voice rougher than usual, "I've been better." The audience laughed, thinking it was set up for a joke. But Dean didn't follow it with a punchline. He just sat there, and the silence stretched out uncomfortably. Johnny, sensing something significant was happening, didn't try to fill the silence with humor. He simply said, "You want to talk about it?" Dean looked down at his hands, those shaking hands that betrayed everything he was trying to hide. "My son," Dean said quietly. "I lost my boy." The audience went completely silent. What most of America didn't know, or had forgotten, in the 6 months since it happened, was that Dean Martin's son, Dean Paul Martin Jr., had died in a military training accident. Dean Paul, who everyone called Dino, was 35 years old, an Air National Guard pilot flying an F-4 Phantom fighter jet when it crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains on March 21st, 1987. Wait, March 21st, 1987. That was today. This Tonight Show taping was happening on the exact 6-month anniversary of Dino's death. Johnny's face showed immediate understanding and compassion. "Dean, I didn't know you'd want to. We don't have to talk about this if—" "I need to," Dean interrupted, his voice stronger now. "I need to talk about him, Johnny. Because if I don't talk about him, if I don't say his name, it's like he's disappearing twice." The raw honesty of that statement hit everyone in the studio. This wasn't the smooth, unflappable Dean Martin they knew. This was a father in agony. "Tell me about Dino," Johnny said gently, and Dean Martin began to talk. "He was my boy," Dean started, and immediately his voice cracked. "He was supposed to outlive me. That's how it works, right? Parents go first, kids carry on. That's the natural order." He paused, struggling to compose himself. "Dino was different from me. I made my career pretending to be drunk, playing the fool, being the guy who didn't take anything seriously. But Dino, he was serious about everything he did. He was a real pilot, Johnny. Not like the ones I played in movies, a real military pilot. Dean's hands gripped the armrests of the chair, trying to steady himself. He called me 2 days before it happened, the accident. He called me from the base, and you know what he said? He said, "Dad, I love what I'm doing. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And I was so proud of him, Johnny. So damn proud. The audience was crying now. So were several crew members. Johnny's eyes were glistening with tears he was trying to hold back. The day it happened, Dean continued, his voice barely above a whisper. March 21st, 6 months ago today. I was at home, and the military officers came to my door, and the second I saw them, I knew. Before they said a word, I knew my boy was gone. Dean stopped talking. His whole body was shaking now, not just his hands. Johnny reached over and put his hand on Dean's arm, a simple gesture of support that spoke volumes. They told me the plane went down during a training exercise, that it happened fast, that he didn't suffer. And I remember thinking, how do they know? How do they know my boy didn't suffer? How do they know he wasn't scared? Because I'm his father, and I wasn't there. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't save him. This was devastating to watch. Dean Martin, one of the coolest, most composed performers in entertainment history, was completely falling apart on national television. But there was something important happening, something necessary. You know what the worst part is? Dean asked, looking directly at Johnny. I keep forgetting he's gone. I'll see something funny or hear a joke, and I'll think, I gotta call Dino and tell him this, and then I remember, and it's like losing him all over again. Every single time. Johnny wiped his eyes openly now, not even trying to hide his tears. Dean, I can't imagine what you're going through. Nobody can. Dean said, unless you've lost a child, you can't understand it. It's not like losing a parent or a friend. It's like part of your soul got ripped out. There's this hole inside me, and nothing fills it. Not work, not performing, not anything. He looked at the audience, seeming to remember for the first time that millions of people were watching. I'm sorry, Dean said. You folks came here to laugh, and I'm bringing everybody down. But before Johnny could respond, something happened that showed the deep connection between performers and audience. The studio audience began to applaud, not the excited, energetic applause of entertainment, something deeper and more meaningful. It was applause that said, we see you, we hear you, your pain matters. Dean looked surprised, moved by the response. He nodded in acknowledgement, then turned back to Johnny. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Dean asked. Of course, Johnny replied. The night before Dino died, I had this dream. I dreamed that he was flying, and I was watching him from the ground, and I couldn't reach him. I woke up terrified, and I almost called him right then. But it was 3 a.m, and I thought, I'll call him tomorrow. Except there wasn't a tomorrow, Johnny. There wasn't a tomorrow. The guilt in Dean's voice was palpable. He was carrying the weight of that unsent phone call, that moment of hesitation. Dean, Johnny said firmly, you can't blame yourself for not knowing. But I should have known, Dean insisted. A father should know when his son's in danger. I should have felt something. I should have called him. Johnny leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Dean, you loved your son. He knew that. That phone call you didn't make doesn't change the lifetime of love you gave him. Dean absorbed those words, and something in his face shifted slightly. Not acceptance, but maybe the beginning of it. You know what Dino used to say? Dean asked, a small smile appearing for the first time. He used to say, Dad, you make people laugh for a living. That's important. You give people joy. And I'd tell him, what you do is more important. You protect people. And he'd say, we both matter, Dad. Different ways, but we both matter. The smile faded. He was wise, my boy, wiser than his old man. Johnny said something then that would become one of the most quoted moments in Tonight Show history. Dean, being a father doesn't end when your child dies. You're still Dino's father. And by talking about him, by keeping his memory alive, you're still taking care of him. Dean looked at Johnny, really looked at him, and nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess that's true. Tell us something happy about him, Johnny suggested. Tell us something that made you laugh. Dean's face softened with memory. Dino had this terrible sense of humor. Just awful. He'd tell these long, complicated jokes with no punchline, and he'd laugh at his own jokes before he even finished them. Used to drive me crazy. Dean chuckled, a real laugh breaking through the grief. One time, he's maybe 12 years old and he decides he's going to teach himself to play the drums. Not lessons, just him and a drum set in the garage. And Johnny, he was terrible. I mean, really bad, just banging away with no rhythm, no pattern. It sounded like someone throwing pots and pans down the stairs. The audience laughed, grateful for the lighter moment. So I go out to the garage and I say, "Dino, buddy, maybe we should get you some lessons." And he looks at me, completely serious, and says, "Dad, you can't teach feeling. This is jazz." It wasn't jazz, Johnny. It was noise. But he believed it was jazz. Everyone was laughing now, including Dean, and the contrast between the laughter and the tears that preceded it made the moment even more powerful. "That was Dino," Dean said, his voice full of love. Confident in everything he did, even when he had no idea what he was doing. Johnny smiled. "Sounds like he got that from his father." "Maybe," Dean agreed. "But he was better at it. He was better at everything than me." The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Dean sharing more memories of his son, some funny, some touching, all deeply personal. Johnny guided the conversation with sensitivity, knowing when to ask questions and when to simply listen. As the interview wound down, Johnny said, "Dean, thank you for sharing Dino with us tonight. I know it couldn't have been easy." Dean nodded. "It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Because the people who love us don't really die, Johnny. They live on in the stories we tell, in the memories we share. And if I can keep telling stories about my boy, then he's still here, in a way." Johnny stood and hugged Dean, a long, genuine embrace between two friends who had been through decades of life together. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. When Dean finally left the stage, Johnny didn't immediately continue with the show. He sat at his desk, visibly composed himself, and then looked at the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, "we just witnessed something important. Dean Martin didn't have to come here tonight. He didn't have to share his pain with all of us. But he did, and I think he reminded us of something we sometimes forget. Fame, success, talent. None of that protects you from loss. None of that makes you immune to grief." Johnny paused, choosing his words carefully. "But what Dean showed us tonight is that even in our deepest pain, we can still honor the people we've lost. We can still say their names. We can still tell their stories, and in doing that, we keep them alive." The response to Dean Martin's appearance on The Tonight Show was overwhelming. NBC received over 50,000 letters in the following weeks, most from parents who had lost children, and were grateful to see their grief acknowledged so publicly and honestly. Mental health professionals praised the interview for normalizing conversations about grief and loss. Before this, public figures rarely spoke openly about such personal pain. Dean's willingness to be vulnerable helped countless people feel less alone in their own grief. Dean Martin's career changed after that night. He continued to perform, but with a different energy. The perpetual drink in his hand, which had always been part of his act, disappeared. He was still Dean Martin, but he was also Dean Martin Sr., a father carrying his son's memory with dignity and love. 3 years after that Tonight Show appearance, Dean Martin gave his final concert. He was 72 years old, and his health was declining. But before he left the stage for the last time, he did something unexpected. He looked at the audience and said, "This last song is for my boy, my Dino. He's watching from somewhere, and I want him to know his old man's thinking about him." Then Dean Martin sang "Everybody Loves Somebody," the song that had defined his career. But he sang it differently that night. Slower, more emotional, every word weighted with meaning. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. Dean Martin passed away on Christmas Day, 1995, at the age of 78. Among his possessions, his family found a photograph from that Tonight Show appearance with Johnny Carson. On the back, Dean had written, "The night I talked about my boy, the night I started to heal." Johnny Carson, in his own later years, often cited that interview as one of the most important of his career. "Dean taught me something that night," Johnny said in a 1997 interview. "He taught me that sometimes the most important thing a television show can do isn't entertain, it's witness." We witnessed Dean's grief, and in doing that, we honored his son. The legacy of that March 21st, 1987 interview extends beyond just Dean and Johnny. It changed how celebrities approached grief and loss in public. It showed that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that admitting pain didn't diminish strength. Dino Martin, the young pilot who died in that training accident, became more than just a tragic footnote in his father's biography. Through Dean's willingness to talk about him, to share memories and stories and love, Dino became real to millions of people who never met him. And that's perhaps the greatest gift a parent can give a child, making sure they're remembered, making sure their life mattered, making sure their story continues even after they're gone. Dean Martin walked onto the Tonight Show stage that night, carrying unbearable grief. He walked off carrying something else too, the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that his pain was valid, and that loving his son didn't end when his son's life did. Johnny Carson gave Dean the space to break down, to be honest, to be human. In doing so, Johnny showed millions of viewers that it's okay to not be okay, that grief deserves acknowledgement, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're hurting. Two fathers, two friends, one conversation that reminded America that behind every famous face is a human heart that can break just like anyone else's. If this story moved you, if you've lost someone and felt that same impossible grief, know that you're not alone. Subscribe to hear more stories about the human moments that define us all. Share this with someone who needs to know that grief is not something to hide, but something to honor. And leave a comment telling us about someone you've lost who deserves to be remembered. Because Dean Martin was right. The people we love don't really die as long as we keep telling their stories.